In this video, we will talk about how to install Alice on a Windows machine. Alice is the software that we are going to use to control and configure, essentially talk to our M1K board. It stands for Active Learning Interface for Circuits and Electronics. Couple of assumptions here. One is you're doing this for a 64-bit Windows machine, and that you're not interested in developing your own software to control and configure your M1K board. So the first thing that we would need to do this is to download the software packages. And one of the reasons we have an update is because they have bundled all the software packages into one file. So they have streamlined their installation process a little bit. So the file that we are going to grab is Alice Desktop version 1.3, and it has both the Alice installer as well as the Libsmu library. So that's the exe file that we are going to grab, and the source is this GitHub repository. So I've copied this and I've actually opened this link up in my Google Chrome web browser. The point I want to make before we jump into downloading the package is that this has the 32-bit Libsmu libraries, it has the 64-bit USB drivers, and it also includes the Windows executable installer for Alice. So I've gone to this website and I'm going to first download the exe file that I've mentioned over here. So here is the website that I pointed to. As you can see, the latest release has come in at December 5th, 2020. So this is very recent, and I'm going to grab the top file over here, which I've indicated earlier. So once I click this, it is going to download to my downloads folder. And if I go back to my procedure here, so I've downloaded it now. So the next thing that we would need is to launch the installer by running that particular exe program. So I'm going to go into my downloads folder and double click on the exe file to launch the installer. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to make very few changes, if even that. I'm going to run that installer. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to choose English. It's going to make this ALM software directory. And within that, it's going to create another directory called M1K. That is fine. All this is good. Now it says, I'm going to install 64-bit USB drivers. Yes, yes, yes. I want the desktop shortcuts to be created. So I'm going to leave all the default selections as is and keep moving forward with the installation. So it's now going to complete the installation. Doesn't take too much time. I'm going to finish over here and then say finish. Now, sometimes it actually is looking for Libsmu, the version 1.0.2, but I guess in the package, there is an error. So it's trying to look for version 1.0.3, but in fact, the previous version is already there in the setup folder. So don't worry about this. Just ignore that particular error message and say, okay. Say finish here, and that would have completed your Alice Tools installation. But we have a few more things to do, right? So I've gone through the installation here. The last point here is Alice Tools are now installed. However, we still don't plug in the board yet. We need PixelPulse 2. Now, one of the main reasons we need PixelPulse 2 is because that's the easiest way to update the firmware on the M1K board. So I recommend installing Alice as well as PixelPulse 2 both before you actually start using the M1K board. So again, we have a link here, GitHub repository. I have already opened that up in my Chrome browser, and I'm going to grab the Windows setup file for PixelPulse 2. I'm going to download that and I'm going to install it. And as before, I'm going to leave the default selections as is throughout the installation, the setup procedure. So let's see, I'm going to go into my Chrome. I've opened PixelPulse 2 right here, and I'm going to grab the Windows setup. And if you're a Mac user, you would grab that. Once I click on it, it's going to download to my downloads folder. And once it does that, I'm going to launch the installer in just a second here. Say run. Yes. English is okay. That's the file. That's the place it's going to install. Sure. Next, next. And I want it. You can leave these options as is. And say next, install. I'm gonna go through, install the software. And after this is done, say finish. And right now I don't want it to launch anything. So I'm just gonna. So once you do this and go back to your desktop, you should be able to see all these icons. As you can see, we have many for the Alice tools. We have ohm meter, strip chart, ohm meter, milliohm meter, meter source, Alice desktop, and Alice data logger. So each of these tools has a different application, and we'll talk about that during our lectures. And we also have PixelPulse 2 installed over here. Now, what we can do first is we are going to we are going to launch PixelPulse 2 by double clicking that. And give it just a second here to do open up. And that is the landing for PixelPulse 2. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect my M1K board using my USB port. And once I connect that, it's going to give me a view in which I have the ability to control the channels, look at the voltage and so on. But I also noticed that when I did connect my board, a red LED came on. And that is a good sign, right? That's exactly what you want to see. But in some cases, you may not get the red LED to turn on, in which case you need to go into the device manager over here and update the firmware. So the firmware version that I have is 2.17, which is the up-to-date version. But if your firmware is not up to date, then you should see an update firmware icon active at this spot. And if you click on that, give it a couple of seconds, and then unplug and replug the board back in or recycle the power, your board should have the latest firmware and things should be okay. So that's as far as the updating firmware is concerned. It doesn't take too much time, but that's what we are going to do using PixelPulse 2. Now I'm actually going to close out of this because for my experiments, I'm actually going to use Alice. So just for a test case, I'm going to run Alice M1K desktop. And if I double click that, you can see that the arbitrary waveform generator controls pop up, and then I have the oscilloscope view as well. Now with Alice, and by the way, you should have seen that red LED turn to green right now. So when an Alice tool is active, that red light goes to green light. Now, suppose I wanted to use the voltmeter. I'm going to close out of oscilloscope. Only one Alice tool can be active at any given time. And if I wanted voltmeter, for example, I'm going to double click on that, and that's my voltmeter. So this completes the installation process. Let me just wrap things up by pointing you to the last slide here, which is after the installation of Alice and PixelPulse 2, you would plug in the board. And because we have already installed the USB drivers, it'll recognize the new hardware, red LED comes on. But the common issue that we have seen is with the M1K firmware. So if your Alice tools are not responding, or the red LED doesn't turn on when you plug in the board, then you need to update the current firmware, and we talked about how you do that. You go into PixelPulse 2 and look under the device manager to do this. Give it a couple of seconds, recycle power, and you should be good. All right. I hope that helps.